Welcome to the Health Headliner podcast by Tudu Digital. Our content is informational only and not medical advice. Please consult your provider. Now, let's dive into today's headlines.
Okay, so when you're like reaching for that diet soda or maybe a sugar-free dessert,
Huh?
thinking you're doing something good for yourself?
Yeah.
But what if that little swap is actually kind of messing with your brain a bit? Today, we are diving deep into a new study that's really fascinating, looking at how a common calorie-free sweetener, which is sucralose,
Right.
interacts with that part of your brain that controls your appetite, how hungry you feel.
Makes sense.
You sent us some really intriguing stuff, a detailed scientific paper from Nature Metabolism
Oh, cool.
and a report from a health news site. So let's explore what this all means for you and the choices you make.
I'm ready.
Our mission today is to kind of figure out if these no-calorie options are really as helpful as we think they are for managing weight, and what's actually going on inside our bodies and brains when we choose them over regular sugar.
Yeah, what's interesting is for a long time we've sort of had this assumption, right? If something doesn't have calories, it probably won't have a huge impact, especially when we're thinking about things like weight management.
Yeah.
But what research like this is starting to show is that our bodies and our brains are way more complex than we give them credit for.
Okay.
And even something that seems as simple as just swapping out a sweetener can trigger a whole cascade of effects that we might not expect.
I know, it's so true, and that's exactly what this study out of the University of Southern California is getting at.
Okay.
They wanted to see how sucralose specifically affects brain activity, those
Yes.
hormone levels that control hunger, and even just our own subjective feelings of, am I hungry or am I full?
Makes sense.
So to do that, they set up a really carefully designed experiment with 75 adult participants.
Wow.
And I think a really important point here is that they included a really diverse group of people.
Okay, good.
They had people with healthy weight, overweight, and obese individuals,
Uh-huh.
both men and women. So we can see if the effects hold true across different kinds of people.
Yeah, that's really smart because it makes the findings so much more widely applicable and helps us understand whether these effects might be different depending on an individual's, physiology or their metabolic state.
Exactly.
Yeah, it just makes the findings more robust overall.
Absolutely. So each of these participants came into the lab on 3 separate occasions, and each time they were given one of 3 drinks, either plain water, a drink sweetened with sucralose, or a drink sweetened with regular sugar, which scientists call sucrose.
Right.
And before and after they had their drink, the researchers were busy collecting a bunch of data.
I bet.
So they used functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is a type of brain scan that shows us activity levels in different areas of the brain.
Okay.
They also took blood samples to check hormone levels, blood sugar, all of that.
Wow.
And they also just simply asked people how hungry they felt.
Oh, interesting. A subjective measure as well.
Right, exactly, combining the objective with the subjective. So it's worth taking a minute to break down how they actually set up the study,
Yeah, let's do it.
because this shows how much thought went into this. It was what's called a randomized crossover study, meaning that each person experienced all 3 conditions, the
Yeah.
water, the sucralose, and the sucrose.
Uh-huh.
But the order they got them in was totally random.
That makes sense.
And this is a really good design because it helps to minimize any biases that could creep into the results.
It's like controlling for individual variation, right?
Exactly. And everyone had to fast for 12 hours before each brain scan visit, which makes sense. So everyone's starting from the same baseline.
Makes sense.
The drinks themselves were all standardized. They were all the same size.
Okay.
They had a specific amount of either the sucrose or the sucralose, and they were matched in terms of sweetness. So like how sweet they tasted.
That's a good control.
Right. And they even added this tiny little bit of non-sweetened cherry flavoring to all the drinks. So really the only difference between these drinks was the type of sweetener.
Smart.
Now for the women who participated, they actually scheduled their visits during a specific part of their menstrual cycle,
Oh, interesting.
just to minimize any hormonal fluctuations that could have affected their hunger.
Wow, they thought of everything.
I know, right? So they were looking at blood flow in a brain region called the hypothalamus hunger ratings and blood sugar at different time points.
Right.
So before drinking 10 minutes after, 35 minutes after 4, they also checked hunger and blood sugar again even later at 120 minutes.
Gotcha. So really thorough measurements over time.
Right, exactly. And they measured blood flow in the hypothalamus, which is super important for controlling appetite. They used a special kind of magnetic resonance imaging called pulsed arterial spin labeling.
Okay.
It sounds complicated, but basically it's a way to see how much blood is flowing to a certain area.
Interesting.
And then to look at how different parts of the brain were talking to each other. They used another type of functional magnetic resonance imaging that looks at what's called functional connectivity.
Okay.
And then finally, they used some really sophisticated statistical methods to analyze all this data,
Yeah.
taking into account all those factors we talked about: age, sex, BMI, race, and ethnicity, just to make sure they were really teasing out the effects of the sweeteners.
Yeah, it sounds incredibly rigorous.
Yeah, so what did they find?
Yeah, I'm curious.
Well, the study found that compared to when people had the regular sugar, when they had the sucralose sweetened drink, there was more activity in the hypothalamus.
Mm-hmm.
And remember, the hypothalamus is kind of like mission control in the brain for regulating appetite.
Yeah, that's a key area.
So that finding's important.
It is, and you know what's interesting about that is that an increase in activity in the hypothalamus is often associated with feeling more hungry.
Right.
So that's kind of counterintuitive to what we might expect when we're choosing a calorie-free option, right?
Exactly. And it gets even more interesting because they also noticed that sucralose actually changed how the hypothalamus was communicating with other brain regions, specifically ones that are involved in motivation and how we process sensory information, like the anterior cingulate cortex.
Oh, wow.
So the brain's not just responding differently in one area.
Right.
It's like the whole communication network is shifting.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
And here's the kicker. Unlike regular sugar sucralose, didn't cause an increase in the blood levels of those hormones that usually tell your body, hey, I'm full.
Oh, that's a big difference.
Right? Things like insulin and glucagon like peptide 1, GLP-1.
Okay, so the hormones aren't getting the message either.
Exactly.
That's really interesting because, you know, when you eat or drink something sweet that has calories, your body usually releases these hormones.
Yeah.
And those hormones then send signals back to the brain and they help you feel satisfied. So if sucralose isn't triggering that same hormonal response, then the brain might not be getting those fullness cues that it expects.
Right.
Which I think makes perfect sense from an evolutionary standpoint.
Yeah.
You know, our bodies are designed to expect a reward after we taste something sweet.
Yeah, we've evolved that way.
Exactly. So it's like this disconnect.
It is. And that brings us to what the researchers call the mismatch concept.
Okay, the mismatch.
So they're saying sucralose might be kind of confusing. Our brains, we taste sweetness, which our bodies have learned over time, means calories are coming.
Yeah.
And we should get ready to release those fullness hormones.
Right.
But those calories don't show up, like with sucralose, it creates this disconnect, this mismatch.
It's like a broken promise.
Exactly. And the researchers think this could potentially lead to changes in our cravings and even how we eat over time.
I see. So it's not just about the immediate effects. It's about how our bodies adapt to this disconnect long term.
Right. And to quote the lead author of the study, Dr. Kathleen Alana Page, she said, and I'm paraphrasing here, if your body thinks it's getting a calorie because of the sweetness but doesn't actually get it, that could change how your brain is primed to crave those sweet things down the road.
It's like our brains are always learning and adjusting.
Totally.
And if sweetness keeps showing up without the calories, it's going to recalibrate its expectations.
And so to really get into the nitty-gritty of what was going on in the brain, they looked at those functional magnetic resonance imaging scans, and they saw that having sucralose actually led to greater blood flow in the hypothalamus compared to both regular sugar and plain water.
Okay.
And in this type of brain scan, increased blood flow is seen as an indicator of hunger.
Oh, wow. So it's literally like the brain is saying, I need more.
Right. And on the flip side, when people drank the sucrose, their blood sugar levels rose, as you would expect, and that was associated with a decrease in blood flow in a particular part of the hypothalamus. And that decrease is a signal that's associated with less hunger.
So it's like two opposite responses.
Exactly.
Regular sugar is leading to signals of fullness in the brain, and sucralose seems to be doing the opposite, even though it tastes sweet.
It's like the sweetness is tricking the brain a little bit.
It is kind of...
And they also looked at how different regions of the brain were talking to each other, or that functional connectivity, and they found that after people had sucralose compared to sucrose, there was more communication between the left side of the hypothalamus and the anterior cingulate cortex. And that anterior cingulate cortex is all about motivation and reward.
Interesting.
And they also saw that compared to water, sucralose led to more communication between the right side of the hypothalamus and the left superior parietal lobule, which is involved in how we process sensory information.
So basically, it's like sucralose might be influencing those brain networks that connect our desire for food with reward and motivation.
Right.
And that could make us more likely to seek out food even after we've had something sweet.
And it makes you wonder if maybe because it doesn't have the calories, the sweetness isn't really satisfying.
Yeah, like the brain is still searching for that energy.
Exactly. It's looking
Yeah.
for something that's not there.
That's really fascinating.
And to make things even more interesting, they found some differences depending on people's weight status.
Oh, okay. Tell me more about that.
So in one part of the hypothalamus, individuals with obesity actually showed a bigger brain response to sucralose compared to water, but not compared to regular sugar.
Okay.
And then people with a healthy weight had a greater response to sucralose compared to sugar, but not compared to water.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
No, it's not. And this suggests that maybe the way our brains react to sucralose could depend on things like our metabolism or maybe how our bodies are already regulating our weight.
Yeah, it really highlights that what might be happening in someone with a healthy weight could be very different from what's happening in someone who's struggling with their weight.
Absolutely. And lastly, let's go back to those hormone differences.
Yeah, let's revisit that.
So as expected, drinking the sugar led to an increase in blood sugar levels and all those related hormones.
Right.
But here's the key takeaway. Sucralose didn't do that.
It didn't budge those hormone levels.
Nope, not at all. And the researchers pointed out that these differences in those hormone responses were even more pronounced in the participants with obesity.
That's interesting.
So it's like their bodies weren't getting the same internal signals after having sucralose as they did after having the regular sugar.
So it's further supporting this idea that the brain and the body aren't getting those expected cues after sucralose.
Right. And that could lead to even more disruption in how appetite is regulated.
Right, especially for people with obesity.
Exactly. So bringing this all together, I think this research really challenges the idea that calorie-free sweeteners are this simple solution.
I agree.
The fact that sucralose can ramp up those hunger signals in the brain,
Yeah.
especially in some people.
Uh-huh.
And the fact that it seems to mess with the normal communication between taste, sweetness, and energy intake, it raises a lot of questions for anyone who's using these substitutes to try to manage their weight or the sugar intake.
Yeah. You know, when we look at the bigger picture, this study is part of a growing body of evidence that's suggesting that our bodies are really wired to expect a connection between sweet taste and calories. And when that connection is broken repeatedly over time, it can lead to unexpected consequences for how our appetite is controlled and maybe even for our metabolism in the long run.
It's almost like we're trying to hack the system.
Kind of, yeah.
But our bodies are smarter than that.
They are, and they will adapt.
Right. But as with any single study, it's really important to keep in mind that this research looked at the immediate short-term effects of sucralose in a very controlled environment.
Right, in a lab.
Exactly. It was not real world. And the researchers themselves even pointed out that due to the limitations of functional magnetic resonance imaging, they couldn't actually see what was happening at the level of individual brain cells.
Right, it's not that precise.
Plus, they only looked at sucralose on its own, not as part of a full meal with other nutrients like we normally eat.
That's an important point because in our everyday lives, we don't usually just have sweeteners by themselves, right? We have them with other foods, and those other nutrients could absolutely affect how our bodies process and respond to that sweet taste, both in terms of those hormone releases and what's happening in the brain.
Yeah, it's all connected, and it's also worth noting that they only looked at sucralose.
Right.
There are a ton of other calorie-free sweeteners out there.
So many.
And they might have totally different effects.
That's true. We can't generalize from just one.
Exactly. And this study only gives us a glimpse of what happens right after we consume sucralose.
Right.
It doesn't tell us anything about the long-term effects of using it regularly. But the good news is that more research is being done. They actually mentioned that there's an ongoing study looking at the effects in children and adolescents, which I think is super important.
It is, because that's where we might see some of the most significant long-term impacts.
Right, because their brains and bodies are still developing.
Exactly. So to summarize what the experts had to say in their paper, they basically concluded that these non-caloric sweeteners can definitely affect those mechanisms in the hypothalamus that are in charge of controlling our appetite.
Right back to that mission control center.
Exactly. And they also highlighted that people with obesity might be especially sensitive to these effects.
So maybe even more reason to pay attention.
Absolutely. And I think this really underscores the need for more research to fully understand what happens when people use these non-caloric sweeteners over the long haul.
So with all that in mind, I want to leave you with this thought.
Okay.
Could your go-to calorie-free sweetener actually be messing with your appetite and cravings in ways that you don't even realize?
It's a good question.
Maybe it's worth paying more attention to how different sweeteners make you feel.
Right, like how hungry you feel after you have them.
Exactly. Are you reaching for more snacks later?
Uh-huh.
Are you feeling less satisfied after your meals? It's all about tuning in.
It is, and I think it's a good reminder that even though something seems like a simple swap, it can have these ripple effects throughout our bodies.
Right. Our bodies are way more complex than we sometimes give them credit for.
It's true.
So what are your takeaways from today's deep dive?
Yeah, what stood out to you?
We'd love to hear what you're thinking. What other questions do you have?
Yeah, keep those questions coming.
Because we're always curious to hear what you're exploring next.
Thanks for tuning in to the Health Headliner podcast by To Digital. Like and subscribe for more health news and breakthroughs. Stay healthy and informed. See you next time.